So this is a different type of video that I've been wanting to make for a long time, probably since I started my YouTube channel. I don't think I will make another one of this sort since I don't really enjoy creating my own content. I enjoy editing scenes for movies much more. But I felt compelled to make this because I feel like many people, especially in the West, or really anywhere in this world aside from Ukraine, Poland, and Lithuania, don't understand how the modern Ukrainian state came to be, how the nation appeared. They think of it as an offshoot of Russia, which it isn't, and we'll get into that. Russia refuses to acknowledge that Ukraine is anything but their offshoot. Here's a person from their state TV saying egregious things.
За эти 30 лет они превратили их в единую нацию какую-то, в единый этот. Не факт, что эта война для них не станет мифом в их идеологии, поскольку, как говорится, других-то мифов особенно у них нету. Но в этом смысле они постарались, то есть это...
Essentially what you just watched is a Russian propaganda person calling Ukraine essentially a mixed up, thrown up nation that was just folded together over the last 30 years. They deny that Ukrainians have a history that is separate from Russia. They've always done that. I remember this ever since I was born. I've always seen some comments about this ever since I learned to use the internet. And as someone who comes from Galicia, or otherwise known as Halachina, and who cares about my family history and the history of my people overall, that drives me insane, which is why I am making this video. So let's start at the beginning. Both Russia and Ukraine claim origin in the Kievan Rus, Kievskaya Rus. You can find videos about Rus on a multitude of channels. Rus was a large kingdom that eventually fell apart into several principalities, which was unfortunate because then the Mongols happened. Rus had a habit of building cities with wood on low ground, which was as effective for protection against Mongol siege weapons as wood against fire, which is to say, not at all. The Mongols leveled a bunch of cities to the ground. This is where the beginnings of modern Russia and Ukraine begin to form. The city of Novgorod, which serves as a pillar for Rus in the north, agrees to pay tribute to the Khan. It was ruled by a descendant of the Rurikids, Alexander Nevsky. He also rules over Vladimir. Vladimir, not Volodymyr, which was a different city that we'll get to later. Novgorod is where the history of Russia separates from Ukraine. The word Russia and Ukraine neither have meaning at this point. They don't exist. There was Rus, and Rus is different from Russia. But two vastly different ethnical identities begin to form here. In the southwest, you have another descendant of the Rurikids, Daniel of Galicia, Volhynia, the pillar of modern Ukraine. He is Prince of Galicia, Volhynia, and Volodymyr. This is a different area to Vladimir, as you can see on the map. Daniel, unlike Alexander in the north, decides to fight the Mongols for a while, and is successful at it for a while. He eventually pays tribute too. He asks the Pope for protection, and seeing that he defends Europe against the Mongols, he was crowned by a papal archbishop in 1253 as the first king of Ruthenia. Now this is important because here you see a new term, Ruthenia. At this century, this is what the map looks like. As you see, Ruthenia is Galicia. Ruthenia has nothing to do with Russia. Many people are for some reason confused about this. It has nothing to do with Russia. Ruthenia is another offshoot of Rus, as is Muscovy at the same time. Now, Alexander Nevsky, meanwhile, has a son, Daniil, who becomes the Duke of Moskva, Moscow, and establishes the Grand Duchy of Moscow. At this stage, you have Ruthenia and Muscovia, or Moscow, or Muscovy, or whatever you choose to call it. And as you can see, Ruthenia is very much corresponding to the west of Ukraine. Meanwhile, Moscow corresponds to modern territories in Russia. Daniel also has a son. His name is Lev. or Latinized Leo. This is the man after whom the modern city of Lviv is named. It is the soul of modern Ukrainian culture. I cannot stress enough how important this city is to Ukrainian culture. Music, poetry, art. It all seems to stem from there. Lviv is where the idea of a Ruthenian Ukrainian nation persevered all these centuries. Lev also inherited Kyiv from the brother of Alexander Nevsky. Here you see a Galician ruler ruling Kyiv. Now, Lev's son and grandsons ruled over Galicia and Volodymyr, and eventually his grandsons were Andriy and Lev II. And according to some historians, these brothers, they died together battling either the Mongol Tatars or Lithuanians. And both King Andrew and his brother Lev were much respected in the West. In May 1323, the Polish king Władysław I, the elbow high, with their interesting Polish names, I love them, in his letter to the Pope wrote with regret, "The two last Ruthenian kings that had been firm shields for Poland from the Tatars left this world, and after their death, Poland is directly under Tatar threat." It's interesting how this situation parallels the current reality, with Ukraine being a shield for Poland against another invasion. That is not to say that Poland is being inactive or anything like that. Poland has provided a lot of help to the Ukrainian refugees over the last few weeks. It's incredible to watch. It's incredible to watch how Polish people speak about this online, how helpful they have been to Ukrainians. Going back to the topic at hand, after the Ruthenian princes, the Rurikid princes were killed, the Ruthenian people chose Yuri II Boleslav, also known as Boleslav Jerzy or Jerzy II, as king and knights of Ruthenia and Volhynia and Galicia. He was of the Polish Piast dynasty. What is notable to me as someone who's interested in the role of women is that his mother was of a Rurikid dynasty. She was from Galicia. Her name is Maria of Galicia. And she assisted her son in ruling, and it makes sense why they chose him. But they were not happy about him being Polish, and they killed him. After his death, the Galicia-Volhynia War started over the succession of the Kingdom of Ruthenia. And essentially both Grand Duchy of Lithuania and Kingdom of Poland advanced their claims over the principality. And there was conflict, and eventually the Ruthenian lands were divided between Poland and Lithuania. Poland received Galicia, and Lithuania received Volhynia. So you can see on this map of the 15th century the scope of, or rather the scale of the Lithuanian kingdom and the Polish kingdom. You can see which essentially joined together into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And you can see that it's not only the Galician and Volhynian western lands that are under this Commonwealth. It's also the much of central Ukraine and even eastern Ukraine. And it had remained that way for a long, long time before Russia could put their greasy hands onto those lands. It was just Muscovy, in the north, having nothing to do with Ukrainian lands. Nothing. Something else that is not directly related to this, but that I have felt very strongly about for a while is Roxolana, otherwise known as Hürrem Sultan, in the Ottoman Empire. She was the wife of Sultan Suleiman. Hürrem started the Women's Sultanate, an era in the Ottoman Empire where women began ruling for their sons or just experienced greater power with their husbands ruling. So she's the one who actually started that. She never lived to see her son on the throne because she died sooner than her husband did. But she maintained diplomatic relations with the Polish king. The show Magnificent Century, of course, never shows you that. She's just a subservient, petty person in there. Still the best character, but anyhow, Roxolana was born in Rohatyn. This red dot encircles Rohatyn, where it would be on the map. As you can see, nothing to do with Russia. It's part of Poland. It's part of Poland, which is why she maintained diplomatic relations with the Polish king. She was from Ruthenia, not Russia, which is why this is ridiculous.
Долгое время я не говорю на русском. Я рада, что вы не забыли.
She would have spoken something of a mix between modern Polish and Ukrainian, because she was not Polish, we know she was Ruthenian. Anyhow, eventually, both Lithuania and Poland joined together to form a Commonwealth, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, otherwise known as Rzeczpospolita. The Commonwealth was ruled de facto by a privileged class called the Szlachta, who had the right to elect a king who formally held all the power. And the parliament, which was also chosen by the Szlachta, also called the Sejm. The term Sejm referred to a parliament comprising of the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate and the King. It was a three-estate parliament. The first Polish Sejm was actually recorded to be done in 1180. These early Sejms only convened at the king's order. But after 1573, the Henrician Articles strengthened the assembly's jurisdiction, making Poland a constitutional elective monarchy. So, in all of its history, king's power was somewhat limited. And this is the influence under which Ruthenian lands were governed. So this played a huge role on their mentality, on their ideology, on their statehood identity. Also during this time, you see something else emerging in the Commonwealth. It's the Cossack states, the Cossack Hetmanate, which was located in Zaporizhia, which is why it's also sometimes called the Zaporizhian host. So here it is where it was located on the map. As you can see, it's a large territory. So what was the deal with that? The deal with that was that the magnates, the wealthy landowners in Poland, some of whom were actually of Ruthenian descent, like Jarema Wyśniewski, he and other magnates were just enforcing serfdom onto the Ruthenian people. And the Ruthenian people are very much a freedom-loving people, as the whole world could see right now. And they didn't like that much. So they formed their own state in the wild steppes in Ukraine, which is the Zaporizhian host. The Zaporizhian siege is so important to the national identity of Ukraine. Every traditional song has something about Cossacks. The Ukrainian anthem has a line about the Cossacks. Everything about Ukrainian identity goes back to this warrior state. And these were warrior states. So originally, Cossacks took place in wars on the orders of the Polish-Lithuanian kings. Eventually, though, as happens everywhere, the king wanted to disband some of these Cossacks, make serfs out of them. The Cossacks went to war with the Polish-Lithuanian state. They went to war because they wanted their own state. They wanted their own Ruthenian state. And there was a formal proposal for a Polish-Lithuanian-Ruthenian Commonwealth, the Republic of Three Nations. The establishment of the Grand Duchy of Ruthenia was considered at various times, particularly during the 1648 Cossack insurrection against the Polish rule.
Króli Więta, i garstka szlachty. Dla nich ziemia, dla nich złota wolność, a reszta bydło.
Bogdan Khmelnytsky decided to sign a deal, an alliance, or according to the Russians, to swear fealty to the Russian king, which was a bad move because that led to Russia being where it is right now, claiming our lands, invading our country, and it has done so for centuries. This is a Ukrainian video about Pereyaslavska Rada, which essentially is when Bogdan Khmelnytsky signed a pact, or whatever you call it, with Russia, or rather not Russia, Moscow. Moscow was a state. Russia was not a thing until Peter I called it Russia. This was the Duchy of Moscow. And starting from this moment, the Muscovites claim our lands and our language and enforce their brotherly love on us, which we have no need of. You know, in fact, we detest it so much that there's videos existing like this, where time travelers go back to this moment and stop him. Don't sign this pact. It's destroying our nation. Russia and Austria decided it was their mission to just gobble up Ruthenian lands, Polish lands, Lithuanian lands. They just took it all away because they could. Mind you, the western Ukrainian lands, Galicia, Volhynia, were still not under Russian rule at this time. These territories would not be under Russian rule until 1945. These territories were parts of Poland and Austria. These are the countries that continued to influence them. The central and eastern parts of Ukraine were not so lucky. They were now a part of Imperial Russia. And Imperial Russia, with all its greatness, self-called greatness, was a monster. It was a monster that dissolved the Zaporizhian host, Catherine the Great, and enforced serfdom even before that. The Romanovs, by the way, are not Rurikids. They had no right over these lands. But rarely any imperialist does have a right to the land they rule. It's just the way things are. So, ideology and statehood of Ukraine compared to Russia. There's a different mentality on Ukrainian lands and Ruthenian lands, which were before this under the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And they were still not satisfied. They still sought freedom. They still wanted to form their own state. So imagine the discontent of the people under an empire that seeks to destroy them. There's a huge difference between an electoral monarchy that they were used to, semi-used to, and the same, which was far ahead of its time, and an absolute monarchy enforced by Russia. This is the key difference of modern Ukraine and modern Russia. It stems from here. Poland-Lithuania was a commonwealth, a federation, not an empire. The difference is significant. It is the reason why Ukrainian, otherwise known as Ruthenian language and culture, exists at all. While Russians were imperialist and were all about subjugation, the eastern part was continuously Russified, and we'll go more into detail about this later. Polish people and Lithuanians let Ukrainians pretty much do their own thing as long as they did not rise against the crown, with the exception of Swedish kings who really tried to force convert Ukraine to Catholicism. In 1804, according to a special royal decree in the Russian Empire, all Ukrainian language schools were banned, which led to complete degradation of the Ukrainian population. So many of these laws, I'm not going to mention them all in this video because it's pretty long already. So many laws were created to destroy the Ukrainian identity, to reduce it to nothing. Here is a picture of the Valuyev Circular from 1860, which was issued by the Minister of Internal Affairs of the Russian Empire, stating that the Ukrainian language never existed, doesn't exist, and cannot exist. Well, it does exist. I speak it, and millions of people speak it all around the world, and it's not going to change no matter what Russia does. Despite all of these bans, despite all of this cruelty to a nation, Ukrainians continue on with their culture. Taras Shevchenko is the embodiment of the Ukrainian soul. His poetry about the cruelty of Russian serfdom, about the love of freedom that the Ukrainian people have, about justice, about retribution, they are so dear to us. They are home. They form the basis of our soul. He didn't only write poems. He also painted. He painted Ukrainian landscapes. So gentle, so different, so home-like. This is something no Russian person can relate to as we do. This is our thing. This is our culture. And yes, serfdom was pretty similar, It was the same Russian serfdom that's caused these people to look so sad, to look so poor. And the Russian people experienced the same, but Ukrainians have liberty in their minds. Now, I just need to repeat that the west of Ukraine, this area, was part of the Austria-Hungary at this time. This is the area I come from. This is why I feel so strongly about all of this. Austrians, compared to Russia, they let us do our thing. They let us practice our religion. They let us use our language. But empires like Russia would not allow that. Now, during this time, Ukraine had a huge cultural movement. Poetry, stories, classical works being translated from Latin into Ukrainian. So many creative minds, so many nationalistic minds appear in this century a lot of it under Austrian influences. It all starts from the west and spreads through the whole Ukraine. Here is a map in Ukrainian from early 20th century. Now, this is all personal history. Here are pictures of my great-grandfather who served in the Austrian battalion, the Ukrainian battalion within the Austrian army. He served as an adjutant. This Ukrainian battalion would fight in the First World War, and it would fight for the independence of Ukraine. They were defeated. From what I hear from my grandfather's stories, and my grandfather was 2 when his father died, so he only knows things that were told to him by his mother. His father was at some point imprisoned in Kyiv. I'm not certain when or by whom, but I suspect it was by the Soviets when they took Kyiv. It was later freed, I suspect by the time where the Austrians retook Kyiv. As you can see, the Western Ukraine was still not under Russian rule at this time. What starts to happen during the 20s is the Soviets occupy Ukraine. They do this by appealing to the peasants, which Lenin was very much for. He wanted to appeal to the Ukrainian peasants, to their ties to their land, which he convinced them. The Ukrainian peasants supported the Soviets initially. Then in the 1930s, Stalin happened. Stalin is the devil for my people. My ancestors were lucky enough not to live in the central or eastern parts of Ukraine. But the people that did, everyone knew what was happening. The older people, they would never leave their crumbs on the table. That was sin. You were supposed to eat everything. This is because of Holodomor. Stalin starved millions of Ukrainians. He took away their grain. Why did this happen? He had a disastrous policy. The Soviets rounded up the kulaks, the wealthier peasants who knew how to farm, who were doing their jobs well, and he sent them to Siberia. And then he took away all private property, made it public. And then he took away people's grain, he took away people's cows and pigs and chickens and everything that he could find, everything. People were left to eat tree bark. Some people succumbed to cannibalism. It was a horrific time. Ukrainians were starved, and on their places, in the houses they left, Russians came over. And there you go. That's how you have the ethnic Russian population in the eastern Ukraine in the first place. The West refused to report about this. Walter Duranty, the person from New York Times, who won a Pulitzer Prize, mind you, refused to report about this. He covered it up. And the Pulitzer Prize is not yet revoked, which is a sin against my people. There were humans, though. Mr. Jones was one of them. Gareth Jones was a journalist from Wales who went to Ukraine, who saw everything that happened, and who wrote about it, despite the threats that were placed against him. He was later assassinated by KGB agents when he was somewhere in Asia. He paid for it with his life. He may not have a Pulitzer Prize, but he has a clean and pure and good soul. Now, Russia attacks my people again. They deny our statehood. They deny our separate history.
Они за 30 лет, судя по всему, вообще сколотили нацию.
They deny our identity. They deny our language. And they dare suggest that we persecute Russian language, that we ban it. Nobody banned Russian. The president's first language is Russian. Like, what are you talking about? Yes, children in school are made to learn everything in Ukrainian. That's because they live in Ukraine. Of course they should learn in Ukrainian. Nobody tells them what to speak at home. Nobody tells them what to speak in stores or anywhere in any area of life. They're free to do that. There is no discrimination. Every Ukrainian person understands them, and the Ukrainians who speak Russian as their first language understand Ukrainian just as well. There is no persecution. There has never been that. Russians have this self-inflated national ego where they encourage nationalism towards their own barbaric invader state. But if any other nation has nationalistic people, they automatically become Nazis. It's kind of funny how their minds work, you know. They destroyed so many good people. They destroyed the good leader of the Chechens in the 90s. They invaded Syria, and now they invade my country. More than 90 children have been killed. A pregnant woman has died because of their shelling, along with her child. You can see firemen rescuing older people. Are these the Nazis you talk about? 90-year-old grandmas and grandpas? It's disgusting. And you see videos of people protesting in Moscow in Russia. This 90-year-old lady with her posters against war, and these men, they're not even men, they're animals. They take her, a 90-year-old lady, because she was holding anti-war posters. Like, it's barbaric. It's deplorable, it's disgusting. It's one of the worst things I've ever seen in my life. It may not be the most violent thing I've seen. They did not beat her in front of us, at least in front of the cameras. But to even have the face to raise your hand against an older lady for doing virtually nothing, how do you look at your mothers? How do you look at your grandmothers? It's a shame. Ukraine remembers it all. Ukraine remembers her language being suppressed, her people starved and killed, and it will never forget. Ukraine is not some new state that just came to be 30 years ago. It was not gifted to us. My ancestors fought for it. My great-grandfather fought for it. He didn't win. But, Ukrainian people persevere. Our history goes back to the Kievskaya Rus, just as Russia's does. But we have taken a very different path to get to where we are right now. And we will continue taking a different path. And if Putin thinks that we're brother nations, we're not. We're not. Russia is an abusive ex-husband, and Ukraine is tired of it. Ukraine is tired of him. He will pay for everything.